I recently was quoted in the paper of criticizing the current 9th District Congressman for voting in favor of the omnibus budget bill that included the funding for Planned Parenthood. Yeah. And his response was that, well, the bill included funding for our military. So he said, is Harris not for our military? Let me tell you something. That comment alone is the example of what's wrong with our representation in Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, the process is not an excuse. And lobbing outlandish hyperbole by saying and suggesting that I wouldn't support our military is just political gamesmanship that we see far too often by D.C. insiders. Let me tell you something. I recognize the very real threats that exist in this world. And I firmly support our military and our veterans for that matter. I believe in funding our military. And it is a basic core function of government. And we have to ensure that the Department of Defense is adequately funded in order to protect our nation and its interests. Omnibus bills are very dangerous things. Why? Because Planned Parenthood funding simply should not be handcuffed to Department of Defense spending. Plain and simple. And what we need are leaders who will stand up against this culture in Washington and not only stand up, but speak up as we do. Listen, if people keep trying to feed us this, well, Mark, we're just living in the new normal for America. Those two words ought to make us shake in our boots. New normal. Wow. I would tell you that we ought to reject that premise at every turn. And if D.C. insiders keep telling us, well, voters, you just don't understand the process. Or, Mark, you don't understand how the process works. I tell you, we must reject that at every single turn as well. My pledge to you is that if you will allow me the honor and privilege of representing you in the 9th Congressional District, I will be a voice for a strong national security that's going to ensure our nation's safety against terrorism. You see, I think if you're ever going to really understand where I want to go, you've got to understand where I come from. And the best way I can remind you of that is to simply tell you who my hero is. See, if anybody asks me, Mark, who's your hero? Boy, I can answer that in less than 3 seconds. My hero is my daddy. Well, why is your daddy your hero? Because my daddy is the epitome of an overcomer. My daddy's my hero because at the age of 6, his mama died with cancer. His dad was a drunk, couldn't take care of him, dropped him off at an aunt's house in High Point, North Carolina, and she quickly realized that she couldn't take care of and raise a 6-year-old boy, so she dropped my daddy off at the Methodist Children's Home on Renolda Road in Winston-Salem. My daddy grew up at that orphanage, and I will be forever grateful to the United Methodist Church for raising my daddy. But you know, my daddy came out of that children's home when he graduated high school not bitter, but better. Amen. He immediately went into World War II. My daddy was a waist gunner on a B-17 plane. He had flown 8 missions successfully and had taken off on that 9th bombing raid on November 2nd, 1944. They were successful in taking out some oil refineries there in Europe, and they were on their way back to the base in England when over Holland my dad's plane was shot down. 9 men bailed out of that plane as it went down. 1 of them perished. My dad and 7 others were immediately captured and placed in a Nazi German prison camp where he would spend the duration of the war. My daddy was marched 700 miles in a death march. In fact, the last 10 years of his life, he was bedridden and confined to a wheelchair because of neuropathy that the VA said was due to the fact of the extreme temperatures and exposure that he faced during even those days of World War II. I want my children and grandchildren to be able to look at me the way I look at you. And I want them to know that when the chips were down and when the nation was coming apart at the seams, their dad wasn't willing to just do what was most comfortable. He was willing to step into the arena, and he was willing to fight for the principles and the truth that we have. Can I tell you something? Nobody questions my commitment to the military. When I look at my dad and understand the sacrifice that hangs on the wall in my home, and I see it every single morning,